Chase Lawrence stared out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the skyline of Manhattan stretching endlessly beneath him, its lights glittering like a constellation of distant stars. The city, alive and pulsing with energy, was his kingdom, a kingdom he had built from the ground up. Every inch of this view, every shimmering tower, every sleek chrome and glass building was a testament to his empire. But today, it felt like a gilded cage. The quiet hum of his phone vibrating on the glass table broke his reverie. He reached for it without thinking, his thumb skimming across the screen. A new message from his assistant. Reminder: board meeting in 30 minutes. He exhaled slowly, dropping the phone back on the table. Another day, another deal. Another meeting where the words would fly, but no real conversation would happen. He wasn't sure when he had stopped feeling connected to this world of money, power, and influence, but somewhere along the way, it had happened. Chase ran a hand through his hair, his sharp jawline tense. The life he had meticulously constructed had become nothing more than a series of motions, a machine of precision and predictability. He had everything anyone could ever want: luxury cars, private jets, a sprawling real estate portfolio that stretched across the country. But none of it brought him any peace. The people in his life, the ones he had once considered friends, seemed more like shadows. They were either too impressed by his wealth to see the man behind the dollar signs, or too busy fighting for their own slice of the pie to notice his quiet desperation. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the framed photograph on the shelf beside him. It was a picture of his younger self, smiling wide, his arm thrown around his younger sister Sophie at their parents' sprawling estate upstate. The image was a reminder of a simpler time, of a family that had been whole, before his father had thrown him out of the business, before the rift that had turned everything cold. That was before he had poured himself into the one thing that had always been certain: his work. He had built everything. He had made billions restoring old buildings and turning them into shining new properties, transforming forgotten landmarks into luxury spaces for the elite. People loved him for it. His name had become synonymous with success. But even now, as he surveyed the glass and chrome of his apartment, he could feel the emptiness gnawing at him. He had become the very thing he had set out to avoid: the lonely, heartless billionaire. He grabbed his suit jacket off the back of the chair, his reflection in the window cold and distant, just like the life he led. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive, or loved. Chase snapped the jacket onto his shoulders and buttoned it with precision. He was well aware of the image he projected: polished, perfect, untouchable. But no one ever saw the man beneath it, the man who, in the quiet moments when the world was still, longed for something more, something real, something human. He wasn't sure what that was yet, but he knew it wasn't in the boardrooms or the luxury dinners or the hollow applause from those who saw him as a means to an end. The elevator ride to his office felt like a blur. He greeted his colleagues with the usual practiced smile, his sharp eyes scanning the room for the latest business developments. The meetings bled into each other, endless discussions about new projects, zoning issues, investments, acquisitions. Chase's mind drifted in and out, his thoughts wandering back to his family, his childhood, and the distance that had grown between him and the world outside the glass towers he now called home. By mid-afternoon, his assistant handed him a folder, breaking his train of thought. This came through. It's a listing for a property upstate, Harrow Hill. It's an old mansion. Hasn't been on the market in years. They've slashed the price, she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Chase glanced at the paper. Harrow Hill. He hadn't heard that name in years. It was the mansion where he had spent his summers as a child, a sprawling estate perched on a hill that overlooked a small town. The place where he had learned to ride a bike, where his father had taken him on long walks through the gardens, telling him stories about the legacy of their family. The place where, in the end, it had all fallen apart. His fingers lingered on the page. The house was run down now, the grandeur faded. But to him, it was a symbol of something he had left behind, a time when he had been happy. "Send them an offer," he said without thinking. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, as if the decision had already been made long before the words left his lips. His assistant blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden decision, but she nodded. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Lawrence." Chase stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He felt the weight of the room pressing in on him again. He wasn't sure why the mansion was calling to him. Maybe it was the memories, or the idea of reclaiming something from his past. Maybe it was the thought of escaping the gilded cage he had built around himself. But in that moment, one thing was clear. He needed to see that house, to touch it, to feel it, to reconnect with something real. He walked toward the elevator, the weight of his decision settling on him like a heavy cloak. Outside, the skyline continued to pulse, indifferent to his inner turmoil. But for the first time in a long time, Chase wasn't thinking about the buildings or the billions. He was thinking about something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to want in years. A place to call home, a place to belong. The drive from Manhattan to Harrow Hill was longer than Chase remembered. The roads, winding and narrow, seemed almost foreign to him, like a forgotten passage to a life he'd left behind. His sports car hummed along the asphalt, its engine a soothing contrast to the quiet that enveloped him. Outside, the city's hum had long since faded, replaced by the stillness of the countryside, where the air smelled of pine and earth. It had been years since he had been here, and the memories felt like ghosts, floating in the air just beyond his reach. He had avoided coming back to Harrow Hill, to the place where everything had once seemed possible, only to have it all slip through his fingers. His father's bitter departure from the family business, his mother's quiet disappointment, the sense of being out of place in a world that had always expected so much from him. It was all tangled up in the memories of this house, this mansion. As the road curved upward, the silhouette of the house appeared in the distance. Harrow Manor loomed ahead, its faded grandeur standing tall against the sprawling hills. The roof, once regal, was now covered with moss, and the windows, though still intact, seemed to look out over a past that no longer belonged to him. Chase's breath hitched in his chest as he approached the rusted iron gates. He slowed the car, his fingers tightening around the wheel. The house was even more dilapidated than the pictures had shown. Its stone pillars sagged, ivy creeping up along the walls like an unwanted memory. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, the once beautiful garden lost under a veil of neglect. He parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air here felt different, cooler, crisper. It was as if the very earth remembered everything he had left behind. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. The mansion, the memories, the sense of returning to something that had once been part of him. But then, his gaze shifted to the figure on the porch. A woman. She sat there, holding a baby, her gaze fixed on the mansion as if she had been waiting for something. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose braid, and her clothes, simple, worn jeans and a faded sweater, spoke of someone who belonged to this place in a way he no longer did. The soft curve of her face was framed by the harsh sunlight, and the baby, no more than a year old, rested peacefully in her arms. There was something striking about her, something that tugged at him. Without thinking, Chase found his feet moving toward her. She didn't seem startled by his approach, as though she had been expecting him. Her eyes, a deep green, lifted from the child in her arms and met his with a directness that surprised him. There was no shock, no hesitation, only a calm wariness. "You must be Chase Lawrence," she said, her voice low but steady. He stopped in his tracks, taken aback. "Yes, I am." He hesitated, then added, "And you are—" "Ellie Dawson," she replied, her gaze never wavering. "I'm the caretaker of this place." Her eyes flickered briefly to the mansion behind her, the smallest trace of sadness in them. "And this," she motioned to the child in her arms, "is my daughter Clara." Chase nodded, the introduction feeling surreal. A caretaker? And a mother? That wasn't the story he had been expecting. He had envisioned some local real estate agent, maybe even someone who was looking to sell the property. But this woman, this young mother, was a far cry from what he had imagined. He glanced around, his mind racing. "I didn't realize anyone was living here," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Ellie tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's been a while since anyone's really cared about this place." She paused, the weight of her words settling between them. "But I've made it my home, for now." Chase felt a sharp pull in his chest. He had expected to find the house abandoned, forgotten. But here she was, sitting on the porch, tending to her daughter, as though this crumbling mansion was part of her story. It wasn't just a house to her. It was her life, her world. "Are you planning to buy it?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an underlying tension. His throat tightened. The question, so simple, felt heavy. "I'm considering it," he replied, watching her closely. Ellie didn't flinch, didn't react to his words the way he might have expected. Instead, she shifted Clara in her arms, the baby stirring slightly, and gave him a measured look. "It's not for sale," she said, a quiet finality in her tone. He felt the air between them thicken. "I don't mean to intrude. I wanted to see the place again," Chase said, his words coming out less confident than he intended. There was something about the way she spoke, calm, measured, that made him feel like he was the one who didn't belong here. Ellie didn't say anything for a long moment. Her eyes lingered on him, as if assessing whether he was truly someone she should trust. She shifted slightly in her chair, the baby still nestled against her chest. Finally, she spoke again. "You should know, Mr. Lawrence, that Harrow Manor has been in my family for generations, and I'm not here just because I have nowhere else to go. I'm here because this house is mine, whether you buy it or not." Chase's pulse quickened at the certainty in her voice. There was no hesitation in her words, no room for negotiation. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps this wasn't just about buying the mansion. It was about something deeper, something more personal. "You're a Dawson?" he found himself asking, his voice almost a whisper. The name sounded familiar, like a shadow of something he should know. Ellie met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said simply, "and I've been taking care of this place, keeping it alive even when no one else cared." Chase's mind raced, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. There was so much more to this woman than he had anticipated. The baby, the house, the family history she carried with her. Everything about Ellie Dawson was a puzzle, and he found himself desperately wanting to solve it. But as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just here for the house. He was here for her. Chase couldn't stop thinking about Ellie Dawson as he drove back to Manhattan. Her words had lingered in his mind long after he had left Harrow Hill behind. "This house is mine, whether you buy it or not." There was a quiet strength in her, a confidence that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the way she spoke, as though she had the right to decide the fate of the mansion, or the way she held her daughter with such care. No, it was something deeper. It was the way she belonged there, amongst the ivy and the crumbling stone walls. The house wasn't just a piece of real estate to her. It was her inheritance, her legacy, her fight, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially someone like him, take it away. As Chase sat in his luxury car, cruising down the interstate, his thoughts wandered to his own inheritance, his own legacy, his father's empire. The way he had been expected to follow in his footsteps, expected to prove his worth by building something grander than the generations before him. He had succeeded. But now, as he faced the quiet desolation of his own life, he wondered if it had all been worth it. The buildings, the deals, the fortune. He glanced at his watch and sighed. Another meeting. Another day where he would be surrounded by people who didn't know him. People who saw Chase Lawrence as an entity, as a symbol of success. No one saw the man behind the brand. No one knew what it felt like to be him, to walk into a room full of people and feel like a ghost. It was easy to lose yourself when you built your life around the things you thought you were supposed to want. But now, with Ellie Dawson's green eyes burning in his memory, he wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, he found himself standing at his office window, looking out over the city once more. But this time, it wasn't just the skyline he saw. It was her, Ellie, sitting on that porch, holding her daughter, her gaze unwavering as she confronted him. He wasn't sure what it was about her that intrigued him. Maybe it was her resilience, the way she fought for something that seemed so fragile in a world dominated by money and power. Maybe it was the fact that she saw right through him. She didn't care about his wealth or his status. She didn't need his approval, didn't seek his validation. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. Another message from his assistant. Meeting with the developers at noon. Don't forget. It's important. He sighed and stuffed his phone back into his jacket pocket. But for some reason, this meeting didn't seem as pressing anymore. He had another pressing matter to attend to, one that wasn't about buildings or business deals. It was about Harrow Hill, about Ellie. By the time noon rolled around, Chase had excused himself from the meeting, something he rarely did. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to go back to Harrow Hill, that whatever was drawing him to that old mansion, to Ellie, was something he couldn't ignore. He picked up the phone, dialed the number, and as the phone rang, his heart began to race. Ellie Dawson, she answered, her voice calm but guarded. It's Chase, he said, his voice low. I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet again. I'd like to talk about the house. There was a pause on the other end, and then, I already told you, Mr. Lawrence. It's not for sale. I know, he replied, running a hand through his hair. But I think we need to talk. I'm not here to buy it. Not yet. I need to understand. His voice softened, almost without him realizing, why it means so much to you. He could hear her take a slow breath. Fine, she said finally. I'll meet you at the house, but don't expect me to change my mind. As soon as the call ended, Chase found himself in his car once more, heading back to Harrow Hill. This time, he wasn't just a businessman looking to make a deal. He was a man trying to figure out why he felt more alive when he was around Ellie than when he was at the pinnacle of his empire. When he arrived, the air felt different, cooler, sharper. The mansion, with its peeling facade and overgrown garden, greeted him like an old, forgotten friend. He parked at the edge of the property and walked toward the front porch. Ellie was sitting there again, Clara on her lap, her eyes fixed on him as though she had been waiting. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a wariness in her gaze, something that told him she was still holding back. I wasn't expecting you, she said, her voice more neutral than before. I needed to see it again, he replied. I needed to understand what it is about this place that pulls me in. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She simply studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's just a house, Chase. A crumbling house with more memories than anyone knows what to do with." He stepped closer, noticing the way her fingers gently smoothed the baby's hair as she spoke. "It's more than that to you," he said softly. "I can see it." She looked away for a moment, a flicker of something crossing her face. Something he couldn't quite read. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice quieter now, almost to herself. "This house, this legacy. It wasn't something I chose. It was something that was thrust upon me, and I've been fighting for it ever since." Chase nodded, suddenly understanding. The house wasn't just a place to Ellie. It was her anchor, her heritage, her fight against the past that had shaped her life. And now, somehow, it had become his fight too. "I didn't come here to take it from you," he said, his voice steady. "But I need to know if there's a way I can help. If there's something I'm missing." Ellie's gaze flickered back to his, and for a moment he thought he saw something soften in her expression. But then just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't need your help, Chase," she said, her words sharp, though they were softened by the way she cradled her daughter. "I've got this on my own. I always have." Her words stung more than he expected, and yet he couldn't help but admire her for it. "I get it," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "I won't push you, but I'll be here, if you need me." Ellie looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to trust him, that wanted to believe him, and the part of her that was terrified to let go of the only thing she'd ever fought for. For the first time in a long while, Chase felt a connection that had nothing to do with his wealth or his status. It was raw, it was real, and it was just beginning. The following days blurred together in a haze of meetings and phone calls, but Chase couldn't seem to shake the image of Ellie Dawson sitting on that porch, holding her daughter, her face closed off yet somehow open at the same time. Her words echoed in his mind long after their conversation had ended. "I don't need your help. I've got this on my own. I always have." For someone who had spent his life learning how to get exactly what he wanted, her refusal hit him harder than he had anticipated. Chase wasn't used to rejection. He was used to people bending to his will, whether in business or in personal matters. But Ellie didn't care about his wealth or influence. She didn't need anything from him, and that stung. Despite his best efforts to bury the memory beneath his business obligations, it kept resurfacing. Ellie wasn't like anyone else. She wasn't impressed by his bank account, his status, or his power. And as frustrating as that was, it intrigued him more than anything had in years. On the fourth day after their conversation, Chase found himself standing outside the crumbling gates of Harrow Hill once again, his sleek car parked at the side of the overgrown driveway. He had driven out without a plan, without a formal reason other than to see her again, to understand her. The mansion loomed ahead, its faded grandeur now a bit more familiar, less intimidating. But today it didn't feel like the house he remembered from his childhood. Today it felt like a place where lives were lived, where history lingered like a shadow, and somehow that made it more real. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed the slight shift in the air, a distant hum of life, a sense of stillness, and then a movement. Ellie. She was standing by the garden, bending down to tug at the overgrown weeds that threatened to choke the life out of the flowers she had clearly been trying to tend to. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment, he simply watched her. The way she moved with purpose, the way her hands worked tirelessly despite the odds stacked against her. Her presence, so strong and unyielding, felt like a quiet challenge to everything he knew. Finally, she looked up, her gaze catching his, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and guarded wariness. The space between them, so vast and yet so fragile, seemed to tighten. "What are you doing here, Chase?" she asked, her voice low but steady, though there was a hint of something softer behind the question. I wanted to see how the house was holding up," he said, the excuse falling from his lips as easily as it had in their earlier conversations. But today, it didn't feel like a mere formality. He needed to see her again. He needed to understand why he couldn't stop thinking about her, why her walls, her resistance, had drawn him in rather than pushed him away. Ellie straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans as if trying to erase any sign of vulnerability. She wasn't offering him anything. Not a smile, not a welcome. Nothing that suggested she had warmed to the idea of his presence here. Yet, despite the distance she maintained, something about her demeanor seemed different. Softer, maybe. It was subtle, but it was there. "You came all the way out here to check on the garden?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Chase chuckled, though it felt forced. "I guess I'm just trying to understand what it is about this place that keeps pulling me back. Why it's affecting me so much." He met her eyes, the intensity of his gaze unflinching. "Why you are affecting me." Ellie seemed to stiffen at his words, her jaw tightening as if she was holding herself back from saying something, anything that could break the fragile silence between them. The baby, Clara, was nestled on her hip, watching them with curious eyes, unaware of the tension in the air. Ellie adjusted the baby, clearly uncomfortable under Chase's stare. "You don't need to understand me," Ellie said quietly, her voice softer now, as if speaking her truth was a burden she could no longer carry. "You've got your life. I've got mine. We're not the same, and that's okay." Chase frowned, stepping closer. "But I do want to understand you, Ellie. More than just the house. More than just the history. I want to understand why you're here, doing this all on your own, fighting for something that means so much to you." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, and she glanced away as though the words were too much to bear. She took a deep breath and then spoke, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and quiet resolve. "This house, this place, it's more than just bricks and mortar to me. It's all I have left of my family. My grandparents built this house. They were proud of it, and when they had to sell it, it tore them apart. It tore me apart, too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She turned toward the garden again, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled at another stubborn weed. Chase didn't move. He wasn't sure what to say. He could feel the weight of her words, the deep sense of loss that echoed through her every syllable. This house was more than just a building. It was the remnants of a family's legacy, a place where memories had been etched into every wall, every window, every floorboard. "I get it," Chase said after a long pause, his voice gentler now. "I get why you're holding on to it. But Ellie, you don't have to do this alone." Her eyes shot to his, her face hardening. "I'm not looking for anyone to help me," she said, her voice colder this time. "I've spent my whole life being the one who's had to do it alone. I don't need you to swoop in and rescue me." Chase felt a pang in his chest at her words. He hadn't meant to imply that she couldn't handle it herself. He simply wanted her to see that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. He wanted to help, not as a savior, but as someone who understood what it was like to be trapped by the past. "I'm not trying to rescue you, Ellie," he said softly. "I just want to be here for you, to help you see that you don't have to keep fighting this battle alone. Whatever you need, I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Ellie didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her eyes full of conflicting emotions, skepticism, hope, fear, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of something unspoken. "You don't know what you're asking, Chase," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like to give everything for something and have it crumble in your hands." Chase stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me understand, Ellie. Let me be the one who helps you rebuild." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her back to him as she resumed pulling at the weeds in the garden, her motions slower now, more deliberate. The silence between them felt thick, almost suffocating. But Chase didn't move. He stayed there, rooted in place, knowing that somehow, in some way, their lives were about to change. Chase sat in his car, parked just outside the crumbling gates of Harrow Hill, the mansion looming in the distance like a relic from another time. He had been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart thudding in his chest. He knew why he was here. He had to see her again. He had to fix whatever had gone wrong in their last conversation, whatever had left that bitter taste hanging between them. He thought back to their encounter just a few days ago. "I don't need anyone to rescue me." Ellie's words had hit him harder than he'd expected. The defensiveness in her tone, the way she had turned away from him as if his presence was an inconvenience, had left him feeling like an intruder. But the thing that had stayed with him the longest wasn't her refusal to accept help. It was the pain behind her eyes, the vulnerability she refused to acknowledge, the fragility in her that she worked so hard to protect. Her walls were high, built over years of struggle and loss, and no amount of wealth or power would break them down. But Chase wasn't here to buy her trust, or to manipulate the situation. He was here because, for the first time in years, something about her had struck a chord deep within him. He wasn't sure what he could offer her. He wasn't sure if he could offer her anything at all. But he couldn't walk away. Not yet. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Max, his old friend and business partner. He'd been chasing Chase down for days to finalize a new development deal. Another day, another project. But right now, all Chase could think about was Ellie. Ignoring the call, he put the car into gear and drove toward the mansion. This wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't about fixing old buildings or adding to his portfolio. It was about understanding her, understanding why he couldn't walk away from this place, from her. When he reached the house, he spotted her immediately. Ellie was standing at the base of the front steps, her back turned to him, as she surveyed the front garden. The baby was nowhere in sight, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she had gone inside to rest. But as he stepped out of the car, he saw her turn around and their eyes met across the distance. "Chase," she said, her voice tight, "what are you doing here?" He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Every part of him wanted to tell her that he was here for her, that he wanted to help, wanted to understand. But the words felt too heavy, too loaded. "I needed to talk," he said finally, his voice steady but unsure. "About what you said the other day." Ellie's expression didn't change, but he could see the hesitation in her posture, the way she held herself just a little too stiffly. She hadn't invited him to stay, hadn't made any effort to offer him hospitality. This wasn't a conversation she was eager to have. "Chase," she said again, this time more firmly. "I've told you, I don't need your help. I've been doing this on my own for years, and I'm not going to let you—" "I'm not here to rescue you, Ellie," he interrupted gently, taking a step toward her. "I don't need to fix anything. I just need to understand you. To understand why this place, why this house, means so much to you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the worn steps beneath her feet, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her jeans. The silence stretched between them, the weight of her past hanging heavily in the air. "I've already told you everything there is to know about me," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying the calm facade she tried to maintain. "What more is there to understand?" Chase's chest tightened. It wasn't just the house she was protecting. It was herself, her heart, her past, every part of her that she had buried deep beneath the surface. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice a little rougher now, "I don't think you're telling me everything. I think there's more to you, to this place, than you're letting on." She finally looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something other than cold detachment in her eyes. There was a flicker of something, pain, fear, maybe regret, something real. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost couldn't hear it over the rustling of the trees. "You don't know what it's like to watch everything you've ever known slip away, to have to fight every single day just to keep a piece of your family's history alive, even when the world tells you it doesn't matter." Chase's heart clenched. "I can't pretend to know what that's like," he said quietly, "but I'm here to listen. I'm not asking you to do this alone anymore." Her gaze softened for the briefest of moments, but then she stepped back, as if to put distance between them, as if his words had reached a place in her she wasn't ready to confront. "You think you can help me by offering your version of things? Your wealth? Your connections? Do you think that will make this all go away?" she said, her voice growing louder now, tinged with frustration. "I never said that," Chase said, taking another step toward her. "I'm not offering you anything except the truth. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to know you, Ellie. I want to understand why you're so determined to fight this battle alone." Ellie's breath hitched, and for a moment she looked away, as if struggling with the weight of her emotions. The baby, Clara, emerged from the side door, toddling toward her mother, her chubby hands reaching out. Ellie bent down to scoop her up, and for a brief moment the hardness in her expression melted. "This is my fight," Ellie said, her voice softer now but still firm. "I've made it my fight because if I don't, no one will, not you, not anyone." Chase watched her carefully, noting how she cradled her daughter protectively against her chest. She was guarding herself, her family, against the world that had so often let her down, and he couldn't help but feel the deep, aching truth in her words. "I'm not asking you to give up the fight," Chase said gently. "But I'm not leaving, Ellie. Not until I know you've got someone in your corner, someone who isn't trying to change you or control you, someone who's just here to help." Ellie's eyes flickered with something, a mixture of doubt and longing, but she didn't speak. Instead, she turned away again, her back to him as she began walking back toward the house. She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm not ready for this, Chase," she said softly. "But I'm not saying no either." Chase's heart beat faster, a surge of hope rising inside him. For the first time, he felt like there was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to help her break it down. The next few days passed in a haze of awkward silence and unresolved tension. Chase had tried to push the weight of his thoughts to the back of his mind, focusing on work, as he always did. But Ellie's image lingered in his thoughts long after he left Harrow Hill each day. The moments of her vulnerability, the flicker of something softer in her eyes, haunted him. And though she had insisted that she didn't need him, didn't want him there, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling them together, something more than the house, more than the history of the land. Each time he drove past Harrow Hill, he felt a magnetic pull toward it, as though the mansion itself was calling him back, demanding that he return, that he understand. And though he could sense Ellie's resistance, he knew she was struggling with something deeper, something she wasn't ready to share. That evening, after another grueling day at work, Chase found himself outside her gate again. The sky had turned dusky, the remnants of sunset painting the sky in shades of deep amber and violet. The house loomed before him, the same as it had always been, an old, beautiful thing slowly being reclaimed by nature. But it felt different tonight. It felt like a place where answers might be waiting, if only he had the courage to ask. His heart raced as he parked the car. He wasn't entirely sure why he had come tonight. Maybe it was the weight of his unspoken thoughts, the frustration of trying to find clarity in a situation that seemed as tangled as the overgrown ivy climbing up the mansion's stone walls. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving without knowing what Ellie was really thinking. He knocked at the door, his hand hesitating just before it connected with the wood. He wasn't expecting to be welcomed inside, but he had to try, for both of their sakes. He was tired of walking on eggshells around her, tired of the unspoken barriers that seemed to rise each time they spoke. The door creaked open, and there she stood. Ellie, framed in the dim light of the hallway, her expression guarded but softer than it had been the last time they spoke. Clara was nestled on her hip, her small fingers curled around her mother's shirt, and there was an exhaustion in Ellie's eyes that told him all he needed to know. "What do you want, Chase?" she asked, her voice wary but tinged with something else. Resignation? Curiosity? He couldn't tell. "I don't want to push you," he began, his voice steady but his heart pounding. "But I need to understand. I don't care about the house or the business or the deal we're not making. I care about you, Ellie, about why you're pushing me away when all I've done is try to help." Ellie's eyes flickered with something, maybe surprise, maybe pain, but she didn't let her guard down. Instead, she stepped back, moving away from the door just enough to let him in. A silent invitation, if only for a few minutes. "Come in," she said softly, the words barely above a whisper. Chase hesitated, but only for a moment. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he found himself standing in the dimly lit entryway of the mansion. The smell of old wood and dust was thick in the air, but there was something familiar about it too. Something warm, something like home. Ellie led him to the small living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The room was simple, cozy even, but there was a weariness to it, as though the weight of years and years of memories had taken their toll. She settled on the couch with Clara, who had already begun to drift off to sleep in her mother's arms. Ellie's gaze was distant as she looked down at her daughter, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I didn't ask for this, you know," Ellie murmured after a long silence, her voice low, almost too quiet to hear. "I didn't ask for this house to be a part of my life, but I don't know how to let it go either. It's all I have left of them, of my grandparents, the people who raised me, the only thing I know that's real." Chase felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had heard her say the words before, but now they landed differently. Now he could hear the layers of pain beneath them, the years of grief and anger she had buried deep inside. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that he understood, but the words felt too small. "Why don't you let someone help you?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Why are you holding on to all of this by yourself? You don't have to do it alone." Ellie shifted, her expression tightening. "I don't need someone to help me," she said quickly, her tone sharp. "I've learned the hard way that when you rely on people, they let you down. And I've got Clara to think about now. I can't afford to trust anyone who might just walk away when things get hard." Chase took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He had been in her shoes in a way. He understood what it was like to feel alone, to rely on no one but yourself. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once," he said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of vulnerability in it that even he hadn't expected. I'm asking you to let me be here. Not to fix anything, not to buy your trust, but just to be someone you can rely on. If you ever need someone, Ellie, I want to be that person." She didn't respond right away, but he saw the conflict in her eyes, the way she wrestled with the desire to push him away and the need to let him in. It was in the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the way she shifted Clara carefully in her arms, unwilling to let go of either her daughter or the emotions she had been keeping locked away for so long. "You don't know how hard this is," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't know what it's like to carry the weight of everyone's expectations, your family's, your own. To have everything you thought you knew just fall apart. And then to try and piece it all back together again, only to find that you're the only one left." Chase nodded, his heart aching for her. He wanted to take away her pain, wanted to make things easier for her, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He could only be there. He could only show her that he wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to do this alone, Ellie," he said softly, his words sincere. "You've already fought for so much. Let me be part of this fight with you." Her gaze softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Chase thought he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just fear, something like hope. It was fleeting, gone before he could fully grasp it, but it was there. "I don't know if I can let you in," she whispered, looking down at Clara, who had now fallen into a peaceful sleep in her arms. "You don't have to let me in all at once," he replied gently. "Just let me be here." And for the first time, Ellie didn't pull away. She didn't say no. She simply sat there in the quiet, letting him be by her side. The days following their conversation at the mansion were quiet, charged with an undercurrent of something unspoken. Chase couldn't ignore the tension between them, but neither could he deny that Ellie's words had left a mark on him. He knew that it wasn't just about the house or even about the life she had built for herself. It was about something deeper, something more fragile, that she had kept hidden for years. He wanted to understand that, but it wasn't something that could be fixed with grand gestures or offers of help. It was something that would take time. Patience. And though Ellie had been more guarded than ever, there was a shift in the air. Something subtle, but undeniable. She hadn't turned him away completely. She hadn't asked him to leave, not like before. That morning, as he sat at his desk in his sleek Manhattan office, the phone call from Max came through, urgent as ever. "Chase, we've got a problem with the Westfield project." Max's voice crackled over the line. "The zoning issues are becoming a nightmare. We need to make some decisions, and fast." Chase rubbed a hand over his face, suppressing a sigh. The project had been dragging on for months, and now this, another setback. But for the first time in years, his mind wasn't entirely on the deal. His thoughts kept drifting back to Ellie, to the house, to the part of her he still didn't understand. "Max, I need you to take care of it." "I'll be in later this afternoon," Chase said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I've got something else to handle right now." Max hesitated for a moment. "All right, but don't keep me hanging on this. We're losing time." Chase hung up the phone and stared out the window, his thoughts momentarily lost in the vast expanse of the city before him. He had the power to fix things. He had the resources to solve just about anything. But no amount of money or influence was going to make Ellie's walls crumble. And no amount of pressure from his business deals would change the fact that the connection he felt with her was raw, real, and terrifying. He picked up his coat and headed out the door, the weight of his decision pressing on his chest. Today, he was going back to Harrow Hill. Not to solve anything, not to buy the house, but because something in him refused to leave without knowing if there was any possibility for them, for him and Ellie. The drive to the mansion was longer than usual. It wasn't just the distance. It was the uncertainty, the feeling of crossing an invisible boundary. As he neared the familiar curve that led up to the gates, he found himself wondering if she'd even be there, if she'd want to see him, if she'd want him there at all. But when he arrived, Ellie was in the garden again, her back to him as she knelt to tend to the flowers. The sight of her, the way she moved with such determination and grace, made something in his chest tighten. She was a force, quiet, strong, unyielding. And yet, there was always something beneath the surface that told him she was just barely holding it all together. He took a breath before stepping out of the car, walking toward her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ellie?" His voice was tentative, but it carried across the quiet yard. She looked up, surprised, but her expression quickly smoothed into something unreadable. "You're back," she said, a note of wariness in her voice, but it wasn't as sharp as before. "I needed to talk," Chase said, moving closer, but not so close that he'd invade her space. "About what we talked about the other day." Ellie straightened up, wiping her hands on her jeans, her gaze darting to the baby monitor she had left on the porch. Clara was sleeping, thankfully. Ellie's face softened when she looked at her daughter, and then her eyes shifted back to him, though she remained silent for a beat too long. "You really don't give up, do you?" she finally said, a slight edge to her tone. But it wasn't as biting as it had been the first time. Chase shook his head, his expression serious. "I'm not here to push you. Ellie, I can see how much you're holding in, how much you're carrying by yourself. And He cut himself off, feeling the words rise in his chest, wanting to pour out of him, but unsure how to express them. "I don't want you to be alone in this." Her eyes softened for a moment, but only for a heartbeat. Then she took a step back, folding her arms over her chest. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to watch your world fall apart and be left with nothing but the memories of people who are gone." Chase's throat tightened. He stepped closer, but not too close, giving her space, yet wanting to bridge the gap between them. "Tell me," he said softly. "I want to understand. I want to know what it feels like, Ellie. I can't imagine it fully, but I want to try." Ellie's gaze flickered, and for the first time he saw her truly see him. She wasn't looking at him with the same defensive walls she usually put up. There was hesitation there, vulnerability, a crack in the armor she had built. Her lips parted, as though she were about to say something, but she closed them again, her eyes shifting away. "I can't just tell you," she said, her voice shaky now. "I can't make you understand because you never will. No one could. And I'm not sure I want you to understand. It's too much. It's too painful." Chase stood there, waiting, feeling the weight of the silence stretching between them. She was right. He couldn't fully understand her pain, but that didn't mean he had to walk away. He didn't have to give up on the possibility of offering her something, anything, to ease that burden, even if it was just being there, quietly supporting her as she carried it. He exhaled slowly, stepping closer again, this time more cautiously, his voice low. "You don't have to do this alone, Ellie. I don't expect you to let me in all at once, but I won't leave. I can't. Not without knowing you're okay." For a long moment she didn't speak. Her gaze was distant, as though she were looking somewhere far beyond him, somewhere that only she could see. And then, just as the quiet seemed to stretch into something unbearable, Ellie finally spoke. "Maybe that's the problem," she whispered. "Maybe I don't know how to let anyone in. Not after everything." Chase's heart ached as he saw the truth in her eyes. The walls she had built around herself were high, and she wasn't ready to tear them down. But for the first time, He saw a flicker of possibility, a chance that with time, with patience, she might let him in, if not fully, then just enough. "I'm here," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Ellie looked at him, the uncertainty still in her gaze, but there was something else there too. A tiny spark of hope, a tiny crack in the wall that had kept her so fiercely protected for so long. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The days following their conversation were quiet, tense. Ellie had pulled away again, retreating into her world, back to the endless cycle of managing the house, her daughter, and the weight of everything she had to carry. But there was something different about her this time, something fragile in her demeanor, like a thread that could snap if pulled too hard. Chase found himself waiting for a shift, a crack in the wall she had built around herself, but he knew now that it wouldn't come easily. He couldn't just demand her trust, couldn't force her to let him in. He had to wait for her to find the courage to reach out, to let him be a part of her life, if only a little. He visited the mansion daily, not to pressure her but to offer his presence. He found solace in the quiet solitude of the place. There was something about it that felt like home, even in its crumbling state. Each time he stood there, he felt closer to understanding Ellie, and in some strange way, to understanding himself. The mansion was more than just a building. It was a symbol of what had been lost, what they had both lost. Ellie had made it clear that she didn't want help, but that didn't mean she didn't need it. And that was where Chase found himself at a crossroads. He wanted to give her space, but he also couldn't stand the thought of her struggling alone. It was late afternoon when he arrived again, this time with the intention of not leaving until they had another conversation. He wasn't going to force her to open up, but he wasn't going to let her shut him out either. As he walked up the familiar stone path, he saw her on the porch, the sun casting a warm glow around her as she sat in the rocking chair. Clara was sleeping soundly in a small hammock next to her, a soft breeze stirring the leaves around them. The sight of them, mother and child, was like a quiet promise of something pure amidst all the chaos they had both faced. Chase approached slowly, his steps measured, and when Ellie looked up, their eyes met. There was a shift in her gaze this time, a hint of something softer, something less guarded. "Chase," she said, her voice gentle, but there was still a wariness to it. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "I know you don't want me here, but I can't keep pretending that I'm just some guy who wants to fix everything. I don't want to fix you, Ellie. I just want to be here. With you." She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing through her hair as she glanced away, almost as if she were trying to make sense of his words. "I don't know what you want from me, Chase," she said quietly, her voice low, as if speaking the words aloud made them all the more real. "You don't know what it's like to be me, to live with the weight of this house, this life." "I know it's hard," he replied, his voice gentle but unwavering. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry it all alone." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. She looked down at Clara, who had shifted slightly in her sleep. Ellie's eyes softened as she watched her daughter, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her expression. "I've been alone for a long time, Chase," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house, it's everything I have left of them, of my grandparents. When they died, it was like the world ripped out from underneath me, and the only thing that's kept me going is this house, this legacy." Chase moved closer, but not too close. He respected the distance she needed, even as his heart ached at the rawness of her words. "I can't imagine what that's like," he said softly, "but I can try to understand." I want to, Ellie. And I know you're afraid. Afraid of what letting someone in could mean, what it could cost you. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking you to change your life. I'm asking you to let me be part of it, even if it's just a little. Ellie's gaze flickered with uncertainty. Her eyes welled with emotion, and for the first time, Chase saw the vulnerability she had been hiding for so long. The hardness in her expression softened just slightly, the edges of her resolve beginning to crack. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice trembling now. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore. Every time I've trusted someone, they've left. Or they've let me down." Chase felt a pang of sorrow at her words. He understood that pain, more than she knew. He had spent most of his life building walls around himself, hiding behind success and wealth, afraid to let anyone in for fear they would only disappoint him. But what Ellie didn't realize was that he wasn't asking her to trust him completely. He was asking for the chance to prove that he wouldn't walk away. "I'm not asking for your trust all at once, Ellie," he said softly, his words filled with sincerity. "I just want a chance to show you that I'm not like the others, that I'm here because I care about you, and because I care about Clara too. I don't need you to fix everything. I just want to be a part of your life, however you'll let me." There was a long pause before Ellie spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost to herself. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "I don't know how to let go of the fear, how to stop thinking that if I let someone in, they'll just hurt me." Chase took a deep breath, his own fears bubbling up to the surface. He wasn't asking her to forget her pain. He wasn't asking her to let go of her past. He was just asking her to trust that not everyone who came into her life would take something from her. "I can't promise I won't hurt you," he said, his voice full of raw honesty. "But I can promise that I'll always be here no matter what. I won't leave, not unless you ask me to." Ellie didn't respond right away, but the weight of her gaze held him there, 1,000 unsaid words hanging between them. Slowly she stood up, moving toward him with tentative steps. There was no dramatic gesture, no immediate sign that she had let go of all her reservations. But as she stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face, something in her shifted. For the first time, she allowed herself to soften, just a little. She didn't say the words. She didn't need to. But as her eyes met his, the unspoken trust between them grew, fragile, tentative, but real. "I'm not ready to let go of everything yet," she whispered. "But maybe we can start with this." Chase nodded, his heart beating a little faster. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And for the first time he felt like maybe, just maybe, they were both on the same page. The days that followed their fragile conversation were marked by an unspoken understanding, a delicate balance between two people who were each navigating their own emotional landscapes. Chase could sense the hesitation still lingering in Ellie, the walls she had spent years building not yet crumbling. But something had shifted. There was a new softness in her eyes when she looked at him, a tiny spark of something more than resistance. A quiet acceptance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Chase kept his distance, respecting her need for space, but he didn't retreat. He still visited the mansion each day, offering quiet support, not pushing her to open up or make a decision. He spent hours walking the overgrown grounds, sitting in the dilapidated rooms of the house, imagining what it had once been. There was something about the place, something in its bones, that made him feel a connection, not just to Ellie, but to the person he had once been. The boy who had spent summers there, who had dreamed of a life different from the one he now led. But even as he visited, even as he helped with the renovations in his own way, something gnawed at him. Ellie's past, her history, the things she hadn't told him yet. He knew there was more to her story than she had revealed, and though he respected her boundaries, he couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of those secrets was holding her back from the future they could have together. On the fourth day after their quiet truce, he stood at the edge of the property, watching as Ellie worked in the garden again, a patch of earth she had been tending for weeks. The sunlight bathed her in a soft golden glow, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. Clara was playing nearby, her laughter ringing through the air, carefree and innocent. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost idyllic. But there was a heaviness in Ellie's movements, a reluctance in the way she handled the tools, the way her eyes flickered between the task at hand and the distance beyond the mansion. He could tell she wasn't fully present. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts she hadn't yet shared with him. Chase took a deep breath and made his way toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure what he was about to say, but he couldn't stand the silence anymore. He couldn't let her shoulder this alone. Ellie. His voice was soft, but it carried across the distance between them. She paused, her back stiffening as if bracing for something she couldn't avoid. She turned to face him, her expression guarded, yet there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze. "What is it, Chase?" she asked, her tone still careful, but with less edge than before. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. He could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of everything that had brought them here. "About what you said the other day. About trust. About the past." Ellie looked away for a moment, as though searching for the right words. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk about that yet," she said quietly. "I've told you so much already. I don't know how much more I can share." Chase moved closer, but he stopped short of standing directly beside her. He respected her need for distance, but he also needed her to understand that he wasn't backing down. "Ellie, I don't want to push you. I just—" He took a breath, his heart pounding. "I need to know. I need to know what's holding you back from trusting me completely, from letting me in." She turned to face him fully, her expression softening just a little. "It's not about you, Chase," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's about what happens when I trust someone, when I let them in. It's not always as simple as you think." Chase's heart clenched. He could see it now, the fear she had hidden behind her walls, the fear of losing control, of being hurt again. He could feel it, the same fear that had driven him to bury his own feelings for so long. "You don't have to do this alone, Ellie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to carry all of this weight by yourself. I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to be strong all the time. I just need you to trust me enough to let me help." Ellie looked at him for a long time, as though weighing his words against the life she had built for herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped a stray strand of hair from her face, her eyes flicking between the garden and the child at play. Finally she spoke again, her voice laced with emotion. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "To have everything you've known ripped away from you, to have your family, your life, your identity, shattered into pieces. And when you try to rebuild it, when you try to put it all back together, you realize that all the pieces are still broken." Chase's chest tightened as he stepped closer, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "Ellie, I can't pretend to know what that feels like, but I'm not asking you to rebuild it all at once. I'm just asking you to let me help with the pieces you're ready to share. Let me be the one who doesn't leave." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as though she were caught between the desire to let him in and the fear of letting him too close. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Chase," she said. "I'm scared of what happens if I trust you and you leave, or if I let you see all of me and you walk away when it gets too hard. I don't know if I can handle that." Chase's heart broke for her. He knew what it felt like to be afraid, to be scared of trusting, of losing yourself in someone else, only to have them walk away when the going got tough. But he couldn't stand the thought of her being trapped in that fear forever. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I'm here for the long haul, Ellie. Whatever that looks like. I'm not leaving unless you ask me to. And even then, I'll always be here, just a step behind, waiting for you to reach out." She looked at him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. She didn't try to hide the vulnerability that was so raw, so real. Slowly, she stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she was standing right in front of him. Her breath was shaky, but she didn't look away. "I don't know how to let you in," she whispered. "But maybe I can try." Chase reached out then, his hand brushing against her arm, offering her something tangible, something real. He wasn't asking for all of her, not yet. But he was asking for a chance to prove that he could be there, just as he had promised. Ellie didn't pull away this time, and for the first time Chase felt like maybe, just maybe, the walls between them were beginning to come down. The air was heavy with unspoken words as Chase stepped back from Ellie, his hand still lingering near her arm, the touch tentative, respectful. There was something raw in the moment, something fragile, as if both of them had reached a precipice that neither fully understood, but both recognized. For the first time, Ellie seemed willing to consider something more, something beyond the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. But there was no denying the weight of her past, the pain she carried in silence, and the fear of what it meant to trust again. It had been a week since their last conversation, and though their connection had deepened, subtly, cautiously, Chase could feel the distance still between them. She was letting him in, but just a little. And that little was enough to make his heart ache with a longing he didn't quite know how to handle. She wasn't ready to leap forward into the unknown, but he could see the quiet shifts, the way she would look at him for just a fraction longer, the slight curve of her lips when they shared a moment of quiet laughter, the brief touch of her hand when she passed him something or handed Clara to him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him coming back. Enough to make him believe that there was a chance for them, even if it was slow and uncertain. Chase had come to understand that patience would be his greatest ally. Ellie needed time. She needed space to untangle the mess of her emotions, to understand that letting someone in didn't mean inviting disaster. And for as much as he wanted to pull her close and promise that he could fix everything, he knew better. He wasn't there to fix her. He was there to be with her, whatever that meant. That afternoon, he found himself once again standing in the garden, the overgrown vines and bushes surrounding them like a quiet fortress. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting everything in a soft, golden hue. Ellie was sitting on the steps of the porch, Clara playing nearby, her laughter high-pitched and sweet. There was something peaceful about the scene, something almost idyllic, if not for the heaviness that still hung in the air between them. Chase took a deep breath and approached her slowly, taking his time as he did so. He had learned by now that moving too quickly could scare her off, that pushing her would only make her retreat further. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "Mind if I join you?" Ellie didn't look up immediately, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the step, her posture stiff. When she finally glanced over at him, her expression was a mix of caution and something else, something softer. "I don't mind," she said, her voice quiet, almost distant. He sat down beside her, just close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but not too close that she might pull away. There was a moment of comfortable silence, the kind that had become familiar between them. Clara had wandered off to collect some wildflowers, her tiny hands gripping the stems like treasures. "I've been thinking," Ellie said, her voice tentative, "about what you said the other day. About trying to trust. And I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, Chase. I don't know if I can let myself—" She cut herself off, her voice cracking slightly. Chase turned toward her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her tone. "Ellie, you don't have to rush anything. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking you to change overnight." She shook her head, her eyes downcast as she stared at the ground between them. "It's not that simple. It's never that simple. I've been hurt so many times, Chase. I don't know how to just let go of that. How to let someone in when every part of me is screaming that it'll end badly, that it always does." Chase's breath caught in his throat. He could hear the fear in her words, the rawness of her emotions, and it made his chest tighten. He hadn't known the full extent of her pain, but now, as she spoke, it felt like the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths was coming to the surface. "I don't know what it's like to have my world come apart the way yours did," Chase said, his voice low and careful. "But I do know what it feels like to be afraid, to be scared of trusting someone again, to feel like you're giving them a part of yourself that you can't get back. But Ellie, you don't have to do this alone. I'm not asking you to throw yourself at me. I'm just asking for the chance to be a part of your life. A small part, if that's all you can give. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to find something real, something she could hold on to. "I don't know what to do with that," she whispered. "I don't know how to let someone be part of my life after everything I've been through." Chase felt the weight of her words settle over him, the enormity of her struggle clear in her gaze. He didn't have the answers for her, didn't know how to take away the scars that had shaped her life. But he did know this. He wasn't going to walk away. "I'm not asking for all of you, Ellie," he said softly. "Just whatever you're willing to give. No pressure, no strings. Just the chance to show you that not everyone will hurt you. Not everyone will walk away when things get hard." Her breath hitched, and for a moment it seemed like she was about to say something. But instead she swallowed hard and looked away, her gaze flickering to the horizon where the last of the sunlight was fading into twilight. "I don't know how to trust again," she said, her voice barely audible. "But maybe I can try." Chase's heart leapt at her words, though he knew they weren't a promise. They were an opening, a crack in the walls she had built around herself. And that, for now, was enough. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just want to be here, when you're ready. No pressure." Ellie nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. Clara returned with a small handful of flowers, holding them up proudly for her mother to admire. "Thank you," Ellie whispered, more to herself than to him, though he heard it clearly. And in that quiet moment, Chase knew they had both crossed a threshold. They weren't where they needed to be, not yet. But they were moving forward, together, even if it was just one small step at a time. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Chase stayed by her side, offering his presence, his support, whatever she needed. Because for the first time he understood. Sometimes love wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Sometimes it was just about being there, waiting until the walls were ready to come down piece by piece. The mornings at Harrow Hill were always quiet, almost painfully so. The mansion, with its faded elegance and its quiet decay, seemed to absorb every sound, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a bird. Chase stood at the foot of the garden, his gaze sweeping over the tangled vines and the unkempt lawn. It had been 2 weeks since he and Ellie had shared that quiet moment, the one where she'd allowed herself to trust him, even if just a little. And since then, there had been progress. Subtle shifts. A glance held for a second too long, a touch that lingered longer than it used to. But progress was slow, and Chase had learned that patience would be his greatest strength. Ellie hadn't pushed him away, but she hadn't yet pulled him fully in either. It was like they were in this strange liminal space between where they had been and where they could be. He respected her pace, but there were times when the weight of their silence felt almost suffocating. The connection between them was undeniable, but the walls she had built around herself were still standing tall, and he knew better than to try to knock them down all at once. "Chase?" Ellie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She had approached quietly, her soft footsteps on the gravel almost lost in the stillness of the garden. Turning to face her, he felt his heart give a slight lurch. She was standing there in the early morning light, her hair loose around her shoulders, the faintest traces of exhaustion beneath her eyes. It wasn't just the physical tiredness of motherhood. He saw it too in the way she carried herself. There was a deeper weariness there, one that had taken root over the years. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly, looking down at the ground between them. There was something in her tone that made him pause, a small tremor that he couldn't ignore. "You're not disturbing me," he replied, his voice gentle. "Is everything okay?" Ellie hesitated for a moment, and then, without meeting his eyes, she shook her head. "I don't know, Chase. I don't know what to do anymore." Chase's pulse quickened. "Ellie, what's going on?" He stepped closer to her, but this time he didn't wait for her to push him away. He didn't want to. There was an urgency in her voice, in the way she carried herself, that made something in him tighten. She needed to talk. He could feel it. She let out a shaky breath. "I'm so tired, Chase, of carrying this house, of carrying this burden. I'm scared that no matter how hard I try, it'll never be enough. I'll never be enough." The rawness in her words struck him like a blow to the chest. He could see it now. The strain of years of emotional exhaustion that had weighed her down, the fear that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she fought, it wouldn't change anything. "You are enough, Ellie," he said firmly, stepping closer still, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You've always been enough." She looked at him then, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something almost too fragile to name. Her walls, the ones she had so carefully built over the years, seemed to flicker in her gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to show him something deeper. "I'm scared, Chase," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what happens if I trust you too much. What happens if I let you in and you leave?" Chase's heart ached. He moved closer, closer than he'd ever dared before. He reached out and gently cupped her chin, tilting her face toward his. "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie. Not unless you ask me to. And even then, I'll always be here. I'm not like the others. You don't have to be afraid of me leaving." Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of everything she had kept inside her for so long beginning to break free. She pulled away, stepping back quickly, as if the closeness had caught her off guard. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't be the person you want me to be. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. I can't keep pretending that I'm fine when I'm not. I'm broken, Chase, and I'm scared of what happens if I let you see all of that." Chase's heart raced, and for a moment he just stood there, watching her. This woman who had been so guarded, so strong, so distant, and yet here she was, vulnerable, raw, and more real than he had ever seen her. The quiet fortress she had built around herself was cracking, and he could see the storm inside her, the whirlwind of emotions and pain she had never let anyone see. "Ellie, listen to me," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, He reached for her again, but this time she didn't pull away. Instead, she stood still, her shoulders trembling as he gently took her hands in his. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here to change you. I'm here because I want to be with you. All of you. The broken parts, the scared parts, the parts you think no one will ever understand. You don't have to be perfect for me. You don't have to hide from me anymore." She blinked rapidly, tears spilling over now as she looked up at him. "You don't know what it's like to be afraid of losing everything," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "To be afraid that if you let someone in, they'll leave when things get too hard." Chase took a deep breath and pulled her closer, his hands steady as they wrapped around her, holding her against him. "I know what it's like to be afraid of that. To be afraid of letting someone in because you're scared they'll disappoint you. But I can promise you one thing, Ellie. I'm not going anywhere. And if you let me, I'll be here to help carry this weight with you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It felt like time had slowed down, like the world around them had fallen away. Ellie's head rested against his chest, and for the first time she let herself lean into him. She didn't push him away. She didn't pull back. She let herself feel the safety of his arms around her, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her. "I'm scared," she whispered again, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I know," he said softly. "But you don't have to be scared anymore. Not with me." Ellie was silent for a moment, her body still tense in his arms, but slowly she exhaled, as if she were letting go of a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice barely audible. "But maybe I can try." Chase squeezed her gently, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't everything, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you needed to start the journey. The next morning, the house seemed to hold its breath. The silence was heavier than usual, and Chase could feel it in the air. This unspoken weight between him and Ellie, the promise that something had shifted, but the acknowledgement that the road ahead was still uncertain. He had left the mansion quietly the night before, his heart full of emotions that he couldn't yet put into words. Ellie had allowed herself to lean into him, had allowed herself to trust him, just a little. And that was a victory. But he knew deep down that the real battle wasn't over. The emotional walls she had built weren't going to come down in a single night. Chase sat in his car, parked outside the gates of Harrow Hill, staring at the house through the windshield. The faded stone walls, the overgrown ivy curling around the porch. It all seemed so still, so untouched. And yet the house was alive with its own history. And Ellie's history, he realized, was just as tangled up in these walls as the ivy itself. He had come to realize that in many ways, this house was Ellie's cage. Not the physical house necessarily, but everything it represented. It was the place where she had been abandoned, the place where she had built her walls to protect herself, the place that was both home and prison. But Chase wasn't going to back away. He had promised her that he wouldn't leave, and he meant it. The pieces were there. They were slowly finding their way toward each other, even if it was a slow, fragile dance. He had barely gotten out of the car when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. At first he thought it was just the wind, the sound of the world spinning quietly around him. But then he heard it again. Footsteps, light but unmistakable, coming toward him. Turning, he saw Ellie standing just a few yards away. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back loosely. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alert, a quiet intensity in them. "You came back," she said, her voice soft, almost surprised. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," Chase replied, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "I just wanted to see you, wanted to talk." Ellie's gaze shifted away from him, her eyes briefly taking in the worn gates, the grounds that stretched out before her. For a long moment, she said nothing, her shoulders tense, as though she were holding something in. Finally, she turned to face him, her face unreadable. "I don't know what I'm doing, Chase," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I don't know if I'm ready to open up, to let go of this fear that's been a part of me for so long. It's too much. I don't know if I can keep pretending that I'm okay when I'm not." Chase took a step toward her, his heart breaking a little more at the sight of the vulnerability in her eyes. He had seen that look before, the fear of letting someone in, the terror that they would leave when the weight of her life became too much to bear. But he wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. "Ellie, I know you're scared. I know this is hard. But you don't have to carry it all alone anymore. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm just asking to be here for you however you need." She closed her eyes for a moment, the words clearly battling in her mind. And when she looked back at him, there was a new vulnerability in her gaze, one that hadn't been there before. A quiet acceptance, perhaps. "I'm not used to letting people in, Chase," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life pushing people away, trying to keep them from seeing what's really inside, trying to protect myself. But when I look at you, I don't feel the need to push you away anymore." Chase stepped forward, reaching for her hand gently, his touch hesitant but filled with sincerity. "You don't have to protect yourself from me, Ellie. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you ask me to." She looked down at their intertwined fingers for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her breath. "I know," she said quietly, "but there's something I have to tell you." Chase's pulse quickened, a knot forming in his stomach. He had sensed that this moment was coming, that Ellie would need to share more of her past, more of the pieces of herself that she had kept buried for so long. But nothing could have prepared him for what she was about to say. "I've been hiding something from you," she continued, her voice strained, her words coming out like a confession. "It's about my family, about what happened after they sold this house, after I was left to fend for myself." Chase's heart thudded in his chest. "Ellie," she cut him off, her voice shaky but resolute. "No, I need to say this. You need to understand. When my grandparents died, my parents weren't around. I was left here alone. I tried to make this place work, tried to hold on to what was left of them. But it wasn't enough. And then there was him." The words hung in the air, the sudden shift in her voice making Chase stiffen. Him. There was a tension in the air now, one that was almost palpable. "Who?" he asked gently, though he could already sense where this was going. He could feel the weight of the past in her words, the pain she had carried for so long. "My ex," Ellie whispered. "The one who took everything from me, took what was left of my family's estate, took me, used me. He wasn't who he said he was. He came in and promised to help me rebuild everything, but instead, he used me to get what he wanted. And when it was all over, he was gone. And I was left with nothing." Chase's chest tightened, his mind racing. He had known Ellie's past had been complicated, but hearing her speak of it so openly, so rawly, hit him like a punch to the gut. This was the thing she had been hiding, the thing she had been too afraid to share. "Ellie," he began, his voice low, filled with empathy. "I didn't know." She shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "I didn't want you to. I didn't want anyone to know how badly I had let myself be used. But it's why I push people away, why I can't trust. Because every time I let someone close, they take something from me." Chase's heart ached as he reached for her again, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I'm not him, Ellie. I'm not going to take anything from you. I'm here for you, all of you. And if you need me to help you rebuild, I will. I'll help you make this place yours again, without anyone else controlling it." She looked into his eyes for a long moment, the storm of emotions in her eyes slowly settling. "I'm scared, Chase," she whispered. "But I think I'm starting to believe you." In that moment, something shifted between them. The walls she had spent so long building were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ellie allowed herself to hope, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this weight alone anymore. And for the first time, Chase truly believed that they were both ready to face the past together, hand in hand. Chase didn't know when he'd begun to understand the weight of Ellie's silence. Or maybe it wasn't just her silence, but the things she hadn't said, the parts of her life that had been locked away for so long. As she stood before him now, her raw confession hanging in the air, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something profound. He'd known she was guarded, but now, hearing the story she'd kept buried so long, it was clear. She had been carrying an immense amount of pain. He had seen glimpses of it before, the hardness in her eyes, the quick retreat whenever things got too close. But hearing her speak of the betrayal, the loss, the years of fighting to hold on to a legacy she had inherited yet never truly owned, struck him in a way he couldn't quite explain. They stood together in the overgrown garden, the distant sounds of the city far away, the stillness between them like a quiet chasm. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm amber glow over the mansion's crumbling stone and the tangle of ivy that enveloped the place like a shroud. "You didn't deserve that," Chase said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of it. Not from him. Not from anyone." Ellie's eyes welled with tears again, but she blinked them away quickly, as though she was determined not to show him more of her vulnerability. Her walls, though cracked, were still there, her defenses still in place. She had been hurt before, and as much as she wanted to let Chase in, there was a part of her that was still terrified of being burned again. "I know it's hard to trust, Ellie," he continued, stepping closer to her, the distance between them narrowing as he reached for her hand. "But I'm here. I'm not going to leave. I've told you that, and I mean it." She didn't pull away. Her hand lingered in his for a moment, soft and uncertain, but there was no resistance. She looked up at him, the shadows of the past still haunting her gaze. "I don't know how to do this, Chase. I don't know how to let go of all the fear, all the hurt, and just trust. I can't give you something I don't even know how to give myself." Chase's chest tightened, a deep ache filling the space between them. "You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to give me everything all at once. Just start with something small. Let me in, even if it's just a little. And if you need time, if you need space, I'll give that to you too." She exhaled deeply, her eyes flickering down to their intertwined fingers, as though contemplating the weight of what he was asking. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the soft cry of Clara broke through the moment. Ellie flinched slightly, her motherly instinct immediately kicking in. Without thinking, she pulled away from Chase, wiping her eyes quickly before moving toward the porch, where Clara was sitting, her small face scrunched up in frustration. Chase stood back, watching Ellie as she moved toward her daughter, the tenderness in her movements as natural as breathing. It struck him in that moment just how much of her life had been spent in survival mode. How many walls she had erected to protect herself, to protect Clara from the world that had hurt her. He followed her quietly, taking in the way she cradled Clara in her arms, murmuring softly to calm her. The baby's cries softened into gentle hiccups as Ellie rocked her slowly, her face a mask of both strength and exhaustion. Chase lingered a few feet away, watching Ellie from behind, his heart heavy with the realization of how much pain she had carried alone. He could see the weight of it in the way her shoulders sagged, in the way her eyes grew tired as the day wore on. And yet, she still kept going. She kept fighting for Clara, for herself, for this house. "How can I help, Ellie?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence between them. She didn't look up immediately. For a long moment she just stood there, her eyes fixed on Clara, who was now asleep in her arms. Then finally she turned to face him, her expression softer but still weary. "I don't know if you can," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "but maybe just being here is enough. For now." Chase felt his heart tighten. "I can be more than just here, Ellie. I can be with you. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. Not anymore." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But all she saw was a quiet, unwavering truth. He meant it. He meant every word. "I don't know how to let someone in like that," she said, shaking her head slowly. "I don't know if I can do that. But I want to try, I do. I'm scared of what happens if I do." Chase's chest tightened, a rush of empathy flooding through him. He could feel the fear in her words, the uncertainty. He could see the way she was teetering on the edge, unsure of what the fall would feel like if she let herself drop. "You don't have to be perfect, Ellie," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to take it one step at a time. I'll be here for every single one of those steps." She closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering her strength, and when she opened them again, they were filled with something new, something vulnerable, but also something that resembled trust. "Okay," she whispered, the word barely audible, but it was enough. Chase's heart soared at the soft admission. It wasn't much. It wasn't the full surrender he had hoped for, but it was the beginning of something real. And that was all he needed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie and Chase sat on the porch together, Clara nestled against her mother. The weight of the day seemed to fall away in the soft light, the tension between them ebbing as they shared a moment of quiet. There was still so much unspoken between them, so many things they had yet to confront. But for now, there was peace. And for the first time, Ellie let herself lean into it, trusting that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she could allow herself to believe in. Chase didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply sat beside her, offering his presence, and in the stillness of the moment, they both found a quiet kind of hope. Chase woke to the soft sound of birds chirping outside his hotel room window. He hadn't planned to stay in the city overnight, but the stress of the last few weeks had worn him thin. The meetings about the Westfield project hadn't gone as planned, and the board was growing restless. But as he sat on the edge of his bed, his mind wasn't on the financial documents or the endless emails piling up. His thoughts were with Ellie. It had been almost a week since their last conversation on the porch, since she'd finally allowed herself to lean into the possibility of something real between them. Since she had said okay, the smallest, most fragile word that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. And though she hadn't said it aloud, Chase could feel the change in her. The way her gaze softened when she looked at him, the way she didn't shy away from his touch. But there was still so much unspoken between them, and he couldn't help but wonder if the walls she had built would ever truly come down, if she would ever let him into the deeper, darker parts of her past. He wanted to know every part of her, to hold her without fear of what might happen next. But that was a future that was still just out of reach. Chase stood up and paced the room, frustration settling in his chest. There was a sense of urgency in him now, a need to move forward, to take the next step. He couldn't just sit by and wait for Ellie to come to him. He needed to show her that he wasn't going anywhere, that this wasn't just a fleeting moment between them. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Max. "Call me when you get a chance. We need to talk about the project." Chase hesitated for a moment, but the tension between business and his personal life was too great to ignore. He needed to make sure everything was still on track with the Westfield development. He dialed Max's number and leaned back against the wall as he listened to the phone ring. "Chase, you there?" Max's voice came through, sharp and familiar. "Yeah, what's going on?" "I'm not sure how to say this," Max began, his voice lower than usual. "But we've hit a snag with the zoning permits. There's been some pushback from the community about the project. Neighbors are raising hell, claiming it'll ruin the character of the neighborhood. We may have to rethink some aspects of the design." Chase let out a long breath. This wasn't unexpected. There had always been opposition to such large-scale developments, especially in areas that had deep roots in the community. But it still stung. "I don't have time for delays, Max," Chase replied, his voice tight. "We can't afford another setback." I know," Max said, sounding equally frustrated. "But you might want to think about what this means. If we don't address these concerns, we're looking at a PR disaster. You know how these things go." Chase rubbed a hand over his face. "I'll be back in the city tomorrow morning. Let's meet then. We'll figure it out." "Sounds good. But Chase, are you sure you're okay? You've been on edge lately. You seem distracted." Chase paused, unsure how much he wanted to reveal. Max was his friend, his business partner, but there was a line he didn't want to cross. "I'm fine," he said quickly. "I just have some personal stuff to sort through." Max didn't press, but Chase could hear the skepticism in his voice. "All right. Talk to you soon." Chase hung up, feeling the weight of everything pressing on him. He had spent so much of his life focusing on the business, on building an empire, on proving that he could stand on his own, that he had never really allowed himself to focus on what mattered most. And now, with Ellie, with the house, with the possibility of something deeper between them, he was realizing how much of his life had been missing. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced at the clock. He still had time before his meeting with Max. Maybe it was time to go back to Harrow Hill, to see her again. When he arrived at the mansion later that afternoon, he was surprised to find it nearly empty. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft wind rustling the leaves in the garden. He stepped onto the porch, glancing around for any sign of Ellie or Clara. He knocked softly on the door, but there was no answer. Frowning, he walked around to the back of the house where he found Ellie sitting on the steps leading to the overgrown garden. She was hunched over, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes focused on the horizon, lost in thought. Chase approached quietly, unsure of what to say. There was something about her posture, something closed off, that made his chest tighten. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, startled, and for a moment their eyes locked. But there was something in her gaze that made him pause. Something distant. "Chase," she said, her voice quiet but strained. "I didn't expect you today." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. I wanted to see you." She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. She wasn't smiling, but there was a faint flicker of something in her eyes. "I'm glad you're here," she said, but there was a hesitation in her voice that he couldn't ignore. "But I think we need to talk." Chase's heart skipped a beat. "About what?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she crossed them over her chest. "About us. About where we go from here." He took a step closer, not wanting to crowd her, but unable to ignore the rising tension between them. "I thought we were already figuring that out," he said gently. Ellie shook her head, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "No, Chase. I've been thinking a lot, and I need you to understand something. I'm not ready to let go of the past. I can't just forget everything that's happened. I can't just jump into something new without knowing if I'm ready for it." Chase felt a knot form in his stomach. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the storm of emotions she was trying to hold back. He reached for her hand, gently, slowly, and this time she didn't pull away. "I'm not asking you to forget your past, Ellie," he said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm asking you to let me walk through it with you. Slowly. On your terms." She looked at him for a long moment, her face softened by a vulnerability he hadn't seen in her before. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "I know," he replied quietly. "But when you are, I'll be here." Ellie looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with an unspoken fear and a quiet longing. She nodded, just barely, as if conceding to something she wasn't yet sure she could give. "I'm not ready, Chase," she said, her voice trembling. "But maybe I can try. Maybe we can try." Chase smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't an answer, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were standing on the same ground, together. The days had shifted into weeks, and the quiet moments at Harrow Hill were beginning to feel like home. Ellie had made a choice to lean in, to let herself trust. Slowly but surely, her walls were coming down, piece by piece. She still held on to the past, the memories of loss, betrayal, and heartbreak. But now there was space for something new, something healing. And Chase? He had learned in the most unexpected of ways that love wasn't about fixing someone. It was about walking beside them, through the pain, through the fear, and through the uncertainty. He stood in the garden, the overgrown vines and the fading blooms of the season offering a sense of calm. He had come here to find peace, to find answers. But it was Ellie who had given him more than he ever expected. In the quiet ways she had let him in, small gestures, soft words, a hand held in the dark, he had found something deeper than any business deal or financial triumph. He had found a partner, a woman who, despite everything life had thrown at her, had chosen to let him walk beside her. Chase glanced at the house, the crumbling mansion that had held so much history, so much pain, but also so much possibility. The renovations had started in earnest, and though there was still much work to be done, it was already beginning to feel like something new. A place for them, a place where they could both breathe. Ellie appeared from the porch, her steps light and sure, her presence grounding. She had changed since he first met her. The guarded woman he had first encountered was still there in some ways, but she had softened. There was a lightness in her steps now, a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "How's it going out here?" Ellie asked, her voice warm, though a bit strained. She still had her moments, still wrestled with the weight of her past. But today she was ready for whatever came next. "Slow but steady," Chase replied with a grin, watching as she drew closer. "We're almost done with the garden, and the inside should be next. It's going to take time, but it'll be worth it." Ellie nodded, her gaze shifting to the house behind them. She didn't say anything for a moment, but Chase could see the wheels turning in her mind, the uncertainty of a future that wasn't defined by the pain of the past, but by the hope of something better. "I'm not sure I can ever fully let go of what happened," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words aloud might make them real. "The house, the legacy, my family, it's a part of me. It always will be. "I don't want you to forget it," Chase said, his voice low but sure. "You don't have to forget it. But you don't have to carry it alone either." She turned to face him, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "I don't know how you do it, Chase," she said, her eyes full of quiet wonder. "You just keep showing up. Even when it's hard. Even when I push you away." Chase reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, but it spoke volumes. "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie. I'm here for the long haul, whatever that looks like." They stood there, side by side, the distance between them now smaller than ever. Chase had spent so many years chasing the idea of success, chasing the illusion of power and control. But it was in these quiet moments that he realized what he had been truly searching for. The kind of love that didn't need fixing. The kind of love that was built on patience, trust, and the willingness to be there for someone, not despite their flaws, but because of them. Ellie reached out and took his hand, a simple act, but one that spoke to all the unspoken things between them. "I'm still scared," she admitted, her voice vulnerable. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust fully. I don't know if I can ever stop being afraid." "You don't have to stop being afraid, Ellie," Chase said softly, his thumb gently tracing the lines of her palm. "I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm just asking you to trust me enough to let me be here. We'll take it slow, one step at a time. And when you're ready, we'll take the next one together." Ellie's chest rose and fell with a slow breath, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to truly believe it. The future wasn't certain, but it was hers to build. And for the first time, she wasn't building it alone. She squeezed his hand, a quiet promise in her gesture. "Okay, one step at a time." As they stood there together, the world felt a little bit less heavy. The mansion behind them, once a symbol of all the pain and loss she had endured, was now a symbol of hope. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't whole, but it was becoming something new, something that could be rebuilt. Just like her heart. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of fresh blooms and the promise of a new season. They didn't need grand gestures or sweeping declarations. What they had was enough, slow, steady, real. They had learned to grow together, not in spite of their pasts, but because of them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chase pulled Ellie closer, his arm around her shoulders as they both looked at the house before them. It wasn't just a mansion, it was a future they would build together. And for the first time, Chase felt something deeper than the success he had worked so hard to achieve. He felt complete.